And I suppose that I'm here partly because it should be clear that consciousness is critical for free will. If you want to truly understand free will, you need also to have some notion of what consciousness is. And I do believe that. I believe we must indeed start from consciousness itself. You know, it's consciousness is not just the world not, as was said a long time ago. It is really key to understand consciousness for understanding many issues in both ontology and metaphysics, going from meaning to knowing and certainly to free will. So in the first part, as you heard, I will briefly summarize IAT to the extent that can be done. And it's sort of important because IAT is unusual. It takes things about consciousness from a perspective that's different from the usual one. It starts from experience itself as what truly exists immediately and indubitably, and takes it from there rather than starting, say, from behaviors, functions, or the brain itself. And I do believe that it is essential to have a clear notion of one's ontology when one deals with free will. So that's the first part. And the second part moves from the ontology to causation. You also need, for free will, I believe, a clear account of what we mean by causation and specifically what causes what, which we call actual causation. So that will be the second part that leads to free will and what IAT implies for it. The downside of this rather long, program is that I will have to present IAT and its implications for free will rather quickly, without much time to explain anything in detail, for which I will refer you to at least some key papers. And I sort of ask for your indulgence about all of this. So let me then move to the fundamental message, if you wish, which is this, that to the extent that IAT is correct as a theory of consciousness, there is true free will in a fundamental sense. And I will hope it will become clear later on what I mean by true free will. But that's the overall message. So I will just set a very brief stage about free will by saying that when I think about free will, and I know you have thought about it much longer and in much more diverse manner than myself, I think of it in the following way. I think of it as consciousness, the fundamental requirements. There is no free will without consciousness. That's certainly how I see it. But there are some other key ingredients, which are alternatives. I must be able to envision multiple courses of action, which I call the freedom of imagination. I'll get to that later on. I must have reasons. I must be able to choose based on such reasons, which I call a freedom of evaluation. I must be able to decide and intend an action, the will proper, if you wish. And then I must be able to control, including causing and executing the action, the freedom of execution. Now, these things have been debated for many, many decades, if not to mention centuries, and certainly by the group here. And so I don't want to get into any discussion really about the various options that there could be here. I just want to sort of stake the position I take, which is more about the paradigmatic sort of deliberative kind of free will, which I will then from now on essentially outline in sketch form like this. I am there, conscious. I'm thinking about my courses of action. I could do this or that. I go through my reasons in this idealized scenario and use my reasons to come to a decision, which I then either execute immediately or I keep the intention in my mind and I will do it later on. So that's the basic scenario we'll go back to. There are many other aspects, a concept of the self, the values that underlie the reasons, the beliefs, and then, of course, what are intentions and the issues of origination, autonomy, and self-forming actions. All of that is obviously key. I won't be able to go into all of that. I'm just aware of it. I want to mention, though, the bare bones of this free will scenario. So with that, let me just go to a short introduction to integrated information theory. The key idea here, as I say, different from what normally is done, is that IAT does not start from behavioral, functional, neural correlates. You don't take the brain and ask, how does it give rise to consciousness? How do we solve this mystery? It starts from consciousness itself. That's what needs to be explained. And it does so by identifying those properties of consciousness which are essential. By that, I mean that they are immediate, indubitable, and true of every conceivable experience. IAT calls them axioms. And there is, in fact, nothing that's more axiomatic than that in my mind. It then translates these essential phenomenal properties into essential physical properties, which he calls cause-effect power. Those are the properties that a physical system must satisfy to account for the presence of experience. And those are called postulates in IAT. And finally, the goal is to account for all phenomenal properties in terms of physical properties, not just the essential properties, but also the one that make every experience the particular way it is. So the specific properties that make the experience of spatial extendedness the way it is, that makes time flow, that make objects feel as if they bind general with particular features, colors, sounds, and so on. So that is the overall goal. I'll throw in, because of the preponderance of philosophers here, some very simple-minded assumptions which are not that surprising really that IAT makes. And starting from experience itself, the idea is to proceed with, inference from a good explanation. I prefer not to say best, inference from a good explanation that is based essentially on the notion of realism, that things do exist independent of my own experience. Solipsism is out as a good explanation. Above all, physicalism in an operational sense. The criterion for existence is cause-effect power, taking and making a difference. And that can be embodied essentially operationally in a transition probability matrix. You take something, you check whether it takes or make a difference. That's the essence of what physical means. And ideally, we go down to the smallest units that we can actually observe and manipulate operationally, the unit transition probability matrix, which is simply because if you go down to the smallest units, then in principle, you don't leave anything out. IAT, importantly, actually don't assumes any intrinsic residue. It's ideally fully operational. Everything is cause-effect power all the way down. And so I'll just remind you then, the key step of not starting from physics and trying to sort of squeeze consciousness out of it, not phenomenology out of physics, which is the usual starting point, at least since Galileo, but starting from phenomenology itself, which is the source of all explanation and the target in the end of all explanation. And from this, see how far we can go with an operational, that is, physical approach. And here's a key slide that basically says, okay, you start on the left, basically with Descartes. You take experience, what it is like to be, as primary. That is what exists immediately and indubitably. And then from there, you posit that there is a world outside of you, independent of you, which is physical, takes and makes a difference, and atomic. Here is indicated as a physical substance, say the brain, within the brain, some smaller units, say neurons, or you could take anything you want. Here we have just 4 units. And we can observe them, by calcium imaging, electrodes, you name it, and manipulate it, say optogenetically. Out of this, we can basically describe, ideally, a transition probability matrix for the units. We can see the cause-effect power of this substrate at whatever level we want. And then we want to explain the properties of experience. As I said, the first important step to go beyond Descartes is to say not just that experience exists immediately and indubitably, but to ask, are there some properties which are also immediate and indubitable, but are also true of every conceivable experience? And it identifies 5 such properties and none other than those. And I'd be very, very short. Intrinsicality means that the experience is subjective. It is for the experiencer, not for somebody else, so to speak. Composition means that the experience is structured. It has what IT calls phenomenal distinctions and relations, like a left and the right side. If you imagine waking up from a dreamless nap and seeing your body on your bed in your bedroom with a book in your hands, which is blue, there is a lot of structure there. In fact, immense amount of structure, which is typically not recognized. And all of that structures the experience to be, information now, specific, the particular way it is. Every experience is specific. There is no experience that's generic. It doesn't make sense for an experience to be generic. The 4th property is integration. Every experience is unitary. You cannot decompose it into independent parts. Let's say the left side experience independently of the right side. It's always one experience. This is a property that was recognized by Descartes himself, as well as, of course, by Kant and others. And finally, exclusion. That is the property by which experience is definite in the Latin sense of having a border, a limit. So what my experience contains when I say, come out of this dreamless nap and see my bed, my body, my book, and so on, is what it contains, not less and not more. It doesn't just contain the left side or the right side or the upper quarter. It contains everything it contains and nothing more. It doesn't extend, for instance, behind my back. So every experience not only exists, but it exists for the subject in a structured, specific, unitary, and definite way. Now, the next step that IIT takes, as I mentioned before, is to translate these essential phenomenal properties of experience into essential physical properties, where I remind you, physical means operational, means cause-effect power, with then the prediction that the substate of consciousness in physical terms should be something that satisfies those properties. Now, the translation takes quite some time to go through, and I will not. Okay, this is explored in several papers, and we are still working on sort of an optimal translation. But basically, if existence in physical terms means cause-effect power, taking and making a difference, intrinsicality means that a substrate, a bunch of units you can observe and manipulate, must be able, and I show this here on the left, to make a difference to itself. Okay, and this is the transition probability matrix of a little subset of 4 units, A, B, C, D. They must be able to make a difference, measured here in terms of the probabilities of entering one state from a different state for all possible initial states. Composition means the experience is structured, and therefore, in physical terms, its substrate must also be structured. So we don't consider just A, B, C, D. We consider a subset of it, A, B, C, A, B, B, C, B, C, D. And we get what is called an overall structure of distinctions, here in brown, and relations. Distinctions are mechanisms with a cause and an effect. It could be mechanism A with a cause within the system and effect within the system. It could be AB. These are higher order mechanisms. And relations are causal overlaps between causes and effects. So you begin to get a structure. Information means that the structure is specific, just like experience is. You can't just have a generic distinction, a generic relation. It must be between specific cause state, indicated here, ABC, for instance, a cause state, where the uppercase means on, for instance, and the lowercase means off. And relations might be specific. Some causes must overlap, and if they overlap, they might be congruent. They must specify, for instance, the same cause. Integration means that you take this substrate, you unfold its structure, and then you ask, does it hang together? Is it unitary, like consciousness, or can it be separated into independent components? By this, you do a cut, indicated here by the scissors. You cut out, for instance, unit C. This is a physical manipulation. And you ask, does this make a difference to this structure? If it doesn't, it's not one structure, but 2 at least. So it's not integrated. If it does, it means that the structure cannot be subdivided physically into independent components. And the quantity phi is indeed a quantifier of how irreducible that structure is, how much the structure exists as one entity as opposed to as separate entities. Finally, exclusion. Consciousness is definite. It has borders. It contains what it contains, not less and not more at a particular grain. And here the idea is that you could consider any substrate, A, B, C, D, or you could consider a smaller substrate, like for instance, just these 3 units, B, C, D, and A is called the background condition, or a larger substrate. In principle, you can unfold in full the causal powers of any substrate, but IIT says that just like consciousness, its physical correspondent must be definite. It must contain what it contains, not less and not more. And the way we go about that is by appealing to the key principle in IIT, the maximum existence principle, that says that what exists is what exists the most. So you find the particular substrate that is maximally irreducible. This is called a cause-effect structure. In this case, the one that wins is these 4 units, not 3, not 5, and so on. And you also find, I won't go into that, the particular grain of the units, be there neurons or microcolumns or mini columns, the particular time update, be that milliseconds or microseconds, and the particular set of states that maximize existence, maximize phi. So that's the very quick translation.